Assalamualaikum, greetings and salutations. Thank you very much for joining me on my weekly live broadcast on my YouTube channel, Chu Chimes In. Sorry for the delay, some technical problems earlier on. But thank you very much again for joining me on my live broadcast on my YouTube channel called Chu Chimes In. I'm Fikri Chu. The topic which I've selected to talk about on my fourth live broadcast is, should Chinese vernacular schools be abolished in Malaysia? Now, this question has been asked and raised over and over again since I was in school myself. So much back and forth with this topic of discussion, from coffee shops to mamak shops and even to the highest office in the land. Historically, vernacular schools were established in communities where a certain race formed the majority of that particular community, offering education to the community where education is offered to families in their language. Now, opinions are divided between those who believe that these schools must be abolished and those who believe that they should be left alone. Each have their own arguments and reasons for their opinions. Those who say these schools should be abolished mainly list five of the following reasons. These schools promote race championing, makes the effort to close or bridge the racial divide more difficult. The national language isn't given emphasis. The Islamic religious subjects isn't given enough attention. And finally, discourages national unity. These are just but a few of the reasons to abolish Chinese vernacular schools in Malaysia by those who believe that these Chinese vernacular schools shouldn't exist. There are, of course, many other reasons. So, where do I stand? What is my opinion? For me, personally, I am of the opinion that these vernacular schools should be left alone. Right, let me go through those points which those who believe that these schools should be abolished. Yes, historically, right, these schools aren't or weren't attended by students from other races of which they were established upon. When these schools were first established, you wouldn't find any other race of children enrolled. Currently, however, this isn't the case. All over the country, parents from all races have enrolled their children in Chinese vernacular schools. The number of non-Chinese students have increased not only in urban areas, big cities like Kuala Lumpur, Johor Bahru, Kuantan, but also in smaller towns all over the country. More and more families have opted to send their children to these schools, and there has not been a single complaint, or at least any of which has been widely publicized. These vernacular schools have no restrictions with regard to which race or ethnicity in determining if a student is allowed to enroll. Does this reflect that vernacular schools promote race championing purely because Mandarin is used primarily as a medium of instruction? In no way whatsoever can anyone say anything about race championing with regard to vernacular schools, as there isn't a policy by any of these schools restricting enrollment based on race. Sure, there are prerequisites, right, for those who wish to enroll, of which one is that students wanting to enroll must have basic knowledge of Mandarin. Apart from that, there really isn't anything else. No other prerequisites. Students in these schools aren't even segregated along racial lines. All students attend, learn, and play together irrespective of race and ethnicity. To say that these schools promote race championing is absolutely baseless. I would argue that these students in Chinese vernacular schools are less susceptible to any form of racism. More so now, with the increasing number of non-Chinese students being enrolled and attending these schools. No one is born a racist. Racism isn't in our DNA. No one is a racist just because their ancestors or someone in their lineage was racist. Racism is taught. Children know nothing of racism unless they are taught to be racist. Now, to blame a vernacular school being an obstacle to bridging the racial divide or pushing the wedge deeper between races is totally unfounded. It's just a lazy and convenient excuse, mostly made by parents or people who know nothing of the administration of vernacular schools or don't have their own children enrolled in vernacular schools. As in my point before, if these vernacular schools are indeed racist or teach racism or discriminate their students based on race, wouldn't these schools determine enrollment of students based on race? To claim that the presence of Chinese vernacular schools is a hindrance in the effort to bridge the gap among the many races couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, the presence of multi-races in these schools promotes racial harmony. Of course, some would say racial harmony can also be achieved in a single national school system with all children learning together. How? How is it any different in a Chinese vernacular school? Here again, just because the medium of instruction is in Mandarin, these schools are looked upon differently. Why? Now, being a Chinese vernacular school, obviously, the medium of instruction for most subjects are in Mandarin. This includes core subjects like mathematics and science. Now, Bahasa Malaysia is and never has been neglected or ignored in Chinese vernacular schools. Bahasa Malaysia is considered a core subject and is given equal attention and in fact given special emphasis. To say that the Bahasa Malaysia is not given attention at all is simply wrong. This is the same situation with regard to Islamic studies. With the ever-increasing number of Malay Muslim students enrolling and attending Chinese vernacular schools, Islamic periods have not been neglected. Ustaz and Ustazahs have been appointed by the Pejabat Pelajaran Daerah or school district authorities to these same Chinese vernacular schools to ensure Muslim students do not or neglect the Muslim religion aspect of their education. Now, the same local authorities, which is the Pejabat Pelajaran Daerah, also oversees these same schools to check and ensure that the standard of education conforms to the standards set by the Ministry of Education. Now, more often than not, most, if not all Muslim parents send their children to Muslim classes after school anyway, irrespective if they are attending Sekolah Kebangsaan or a Chinese vernacular school. This basically puts to rest the argument of the national language, Bahasa Malaysia, and Islamic studies aren't given any attention in Chinese vernacular schools. Which brings me to my final point, or the final point, national unity. I did touch on this earlier, where I mentioned in no way do Chinese vernacular schools discourage or hinders national unity. Students aren't segregated. They aren't taught to hate each other, nor are they in any way or form encouraged to mix only with those of their own race. As I've mentioned before, children know nothing of racism. They are as pure as the driven snow. If these children are not taught to be racist, they will never be racist. Chinese vernacular schools, like any other public schools, are focused on education, with only one difference. Only one. Mandarin. Mandarin is used as the medium of instruction. How can a language be a barrier or a hindrance to national unity? Does being fluent in Mandarin classifies one as being a hindrance to national unity? Isn't it an added advantage to one's repertoire of skills to be fluent in an additional language, like Mandarin, for example? From my own personal experience, I have benefited by being bilingual. And English has helped in my line of work where communication is key. Tak percaya saya berfasih bercakap Melayu? Saya fasih. Saya fasih bercakap Melayu sebab saya dibesarkan di Gombak, kawasan Melayu. Kawan-kawan saya sejak dari zaman sekolah 90% Melayu. Pernah di zaman sekolah saya dipersoalkan oleh pegawai Jabatan Agama Islam, kenapa tak berpuasa dalam bulan Ramadan? Mungkin ada di kalangan saudara-saudari tertanya atau terdetik di hati, dah tu, kenapa tak gunakan bahasa Malaysia untuk tujuan lintah langsung ni? Saya tidak langsung atau terdetik di hati, dah tu, kenapa tak gunakan bahasa Malaysia untuk tujuan lintah langsung ni? Saya tidak langsung memandang rendah atau ingin merendahkan martabat bahasa bangsa, bahasa Malaysia. Saya memilih bahasa Inggeris kerana saya rasa saya dapat menyampaikan hujah-hujah dan fakta-fakta saya dengan lebih terang, jelas dan tepat tanpa menimbulkan kekeliruan. Itu sebab utama saya gunakan bahasa Inggeris. Anyway, enough about my fluency in bahasa Malaysia. Let's get back to the topic at hand. I personally advocate that these Chinese schools be left alone. For the most part, I've already stated why these schools should be allowed to continue to offer parents an alternative for their children. Primarily, most parents opt to enroll their children in these Chinese vernacular schools to learn an additional language. Or there will be some out there who will say, or you can do that with the additional classes after school. Why the need to have a school which uses Mandarin as a medium of instruction to have or to learn an additional language? I beg to differ, right? As it is utterly different. An additional language in a school environment compared to learning an additional language via tuition classes specifically to learn Mandarin. The ever-growing number of parents choosing Chinese vernacular schools to enroll their children in is proof in itself the trust and confidence they have in these schools. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am in no way discrediting the Sekolah Kebangsaan or national schools. I myself, personally, attended the Sekolah Kebangsaan. But I have opted to send my own children to a Chinese vernacular school. At the end of the day, it's a matter of choice. Why should the authorities deprive parents who wish to enroll their children in Chinese vernacular schools? Like me, some parents or families would like to have a choice. Freedom with which to determine how we want our children to be educated. Sadly, this discussion on the relevance of Chinese vernacular schools has become a political issue. My point is simple and straightforward. Education must not be politicized. Must not be politicized. Yes, as I've mentioned, historically, these Chinese vernacular schools were attended only by Chinese students. Historically. This gives rise to the perception that these schools are racially inclined and thus racist in nature. Again, however, this is just no longer the case. These schools may or may not have been racially inclined, but these schools in this day and age has evolved with more and more non-Chinese families opting to send their children there to be educated. Who is anyone to say? Who is anyone to say that parents, right, who opt to send their children to a Chinese vernacular schools aren't patriotic? Just because they choose a school which chooses Mandarin as a medium of instruction, is it not up to the parents? Right? Is it not up to the parents to determine what's best for their own children? Let's not be influenced by politics and political influence, using education of our children as pawns in their political games. As I said before, it's a matter of choice. Choices which we as parents must be allowed to make to determine how we want our children to be educated. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Till we meet again. As always, stay safe, be well, always wear a mask outdoors, please. Assalamu alaikum.